London, early 1930s. The streets were alive with the rhythm of post-war recovery. Flickering lamps, jazz pouring out of smoky pubs, and men in flat caps hurrying through the fog. And somewhere between those cobblestone alleys walked a man named Eddie Chapman, charming, reckless, and entirely unpredictable. Eddie wasn't born a villain, he was born restless. The kind of man who looked at locked doors not as barriers, but as invitations. While others dreamed of careers, Eddie dreamed of escape, from routine, from rules, from the smallness of life. By his 20s, he had already become a master safecracker, using explosives with an artist's precision. He dressed sharply, moved gracefully, and spoke like a gentleman. Newspapers later called him the gentleman crook. He didn't carry guns, didn't hurt people, he simply outsmarted them. But Eddie's dance with the law couldn't last forever. The more daring the heists, the louder his name echoed through the police radios. Eventually, the game caught up with him. He was arrested and sent to prison on Jersey Island, a quiet speck in the English Channel. Too small for freedom, too close to the coming storm. And that storm had a name: World War II. In 1940, the unimaginable happened. The German army swept across Europe, and soon even the peaceful Channel Islands fell under Nazi occupation. Behind the prison bars, Eddie watched soldiers in gray uniforms march through streets that once smelled of salt and freedom. For most inmates, it was terrifying. For Chapman, it was intriguing. He had lived his life by spotting opportunities where others saw dead ends, and this, somehow, felt like one of those moments. He didn't know it yet, but the same man who once blew open safes for money would soon blow open the gates of history. Because one morning, as the sun rose over the occupied island, the guards called Eddie's name. A group of German officers stood waiting. Their polished boots glistened on the stone floor. One of them spoke, his accent sharp and deliberate. "Mr. Chapman, we believe you have certain skills." And just like that, a thief's life took a turn no one could have predicted. That day, Eddie Chapman walked out of his prison cell, not as a free man, but as a recruit for the German intelligence service. He was about to enter a world far more dangerous than any heist, one filled with lies, codes, and impossible choices. A world where loyalty was a currency, and betrayal was the price of survival. Little did the Germans know, the man they were about to train would become their greatest deception. They thought they were recruiting a loyal spy. What they didn't know was that they were handing Britain a weapon wrapped in charm and chaos. And that's where our story truly begins. The moment when Eddie Chapman, the gentleman thief, began his transformation into Agent Zigzag, the double agent who would fool the Nazis themselves. They thought they were recruiting a loyal spy. What they didn't know was that they were handing Britain a weapon wrapped in charm and chaos. And that's where our story truly begins. The moment when Eddie Chapman, the gentleman thief, began his transformation into Agent Zigzag, the double agent who would fool the Nazis themselves. It began with a simple proposition, one that could have meant freedom, fortune, or death. When the German officers approached Eddie Chapman in that small gray prison on Jersey Island, he had no illusions about who they were. He'd seen their kind before, the polished boots, the cold confidence, the absolute belief that their empire would last 1,000 years. But as they spoke, Eddie realized something extraordinary. They weren't there to punish him. They were there to recruit him. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, had heard of Eddie's past, his expertise with explosives, his talent for disguise, his ability to vanish without a trace. To them, he wasn't a criminal, he was a potential weapon. And Eddie, ever the opportunist, listened carefully. They offered him a deal: training, money, and freedom in exchange for a simple mission. He was to return to Britain, the land that had imprisoned him, and sabotage key targets to aid the Nazi war effort. Most men would have hesitated. Eddie smiled. To him, this wasn't treason. It was a game. A game of survival, a game of chance, and, if he played it right, a game he could win on both sides. Weeks later, Eddie was smuggled out of Jersey and taken to France. There, deep in occupied territory, he was brought to a secret training camp run by the Abwehr. It was a place where men learned the art of espionage, silent killing, encryption, wireless communication, explosives. Eddie soaked it all in like a schoolboy learning magic tricks. He wasn't just learning how to be a spy, he was studying how the enemy thought. They taught him to speak with authority, to send coded messages, to build bombs from nothing but scraps of wire and imagination. And through it all, Chapman played the perfect student, loyal, eager, disciplined. But behind those sharp blue eyes, a different plan was forming. He told himself, if I ever get back to England, I'll turn myself in. I'll tell MI5 everything. I'll become their double. He wasn't doing it out of patriotism, not yet. He was doing it for the thrill, for the danger, for that strange moral gray area where only people like him seemed to thrive. In December 1942, under a cold, moonless sky, the Germans gave him his first real mission. They handed him a British uniform, a pistol, a parachute, and a new identity, Agent Fritz. His target, the De Havilland Keckraft factory in Hertfordshire, where the British were producing mosquito bombers, some of the fastest and most feared planes of the war. He would parachute into England, rendezvous with German contacts, plant explosives, and disappear before sunrise. It was, on paper, a suicide mission. But as the plane climbed into the night, Chapman wasn't thinking about death. He was thinking about what he'd do after he landed. The jump went as planned. The wind bit through his uniform as he descended into the English countryside, the dark fields stretching endlessly below him. When his boots finally hit the ground, he took a deep breath. He was home. Not as a criminal, not as a soldier, but as something in between. He buried his parachute, looked toward the horizon, and whispered to himself, "All right, let's see who's really playing who." Then, instead of heading for his target, Eddie Chapman did something that stunned history. He walked straight to the nearest police station and turned himself in. He asked to speak to the British Security Service, MI5. Within hours, a small team of intelligence officers gathered in a dimly lit room, trying to make sense of this man. A convicted thief, a German-trained spy, standing before them claiming he wanted to help Britain. They had no reason to trust him. But Eddie Chapman had one thing that every great con artist and every great spy needs most: charisma. He looked them in the eye and said calmly, "Gentlemen, I think I can be of use to you." And so began one of the most unlikely alliances of the entire war, a partnership between Britain's intelligence service and a man they'd once locked behind bars. The Germans believed they'd created a perfect spy, but MI5 was about to turn him into something even more dangerous: a double agent, a trickster, a man who would soon earn the code name that defined his life: Zigzag. When Eddie Chapman walked into MI5 headquarters that cold morning in 1942, he looked nothing like a hero. He was unshaven, mud-stained, and wearing a borrowed coat that didn't fit. But the moment he began to speak, every man in that room realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary criminal. Eddie told his story clearly, almost cheerfully, how he'd been recruited by the Germans, trained in France, and parachuted back into Britain to blow up one of its most important aircraft factories. But instead of carrying out the mission, he'd come straight to them. He leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, and said with a grin, "Gentlemen, I can work for you instead." The MI5 officers glanced at one another. Was this man insane or brilliant? They had seen spies before, frightened men, desperate, often broken. But Chapman was different. He was enjoying himself. He spoke with confidence, even charm. And deep down, the agents knew that a man who could deceive the Germans so effortlessly might just be the perfect weapon for Britain. After hours of questioning, MI5 decided to take a risk. They would turn him. Agent Fritz of the Germans would become Agent Zigzag of the British. It wasn't just a code name. Zigzag perfectly captured his nature, unpredictable, quick-thinking, darting from side to side like lightning. Chapman was assigned a handler named Ronald Reed, a calm, meticulous MI5 officer who would become both his supervisor and, in time, one of the few people Eddie truly respected. Their partnership was unlikely, the disciplined intelligence officer and the rogue safecracker, but together they would orchestrate one of the most extraordinary deception campaigns of World War II. The first task was simple in theory, nearly impossible in practice. Convince the Germans that Chapman had successfully completed his sabotage mission. To do that, MI5 decided to stage the destruction of the de Havilland factory. They would use fake photos, damaged equipment, and false reports, and Chapman would deliver the story himself. But before any of that could happen, he had to regain contact with his German handlers. That meant writing letters and sending coded messages through secret radio transmissions. Eddie threw himself into the work with enthusiasm. He spent hours crafting the perfect lie, one that sounded just flawed enough to be believable. He described how he'd slipped into the factory, planted explosives, and escaped into the night as the building went up in flames. The Germans swallowed every word. When they radioed back their congratulations, Chapman smiled to himself. He had fooled one of the most feared intelligence services in the world, and he was only getting started. As his confidence grew, MI5 allowed him more freedom. He began helping with other operations, spreading misinformation about troop movements, feeding the Germans false data about bombing accuracy, and even manipulating weather reports to throw off their reconnaissance. Each time, Chapman's charm proved invaluable. He knew exactly how to sound, just the right mix of pride and modesty to keep his German handlers loyal and unsuspecting. But behind the charm, the stakes were deadly serious. If the Germans ever discovered the truth, Eddie would be executed on sight. Even MI5 didn't fully trust him at first. Every message he sent, every meeting he requested, every line of code was double-checked, verified, and sometimes rewritten. The truth was, Chapman was walking a tightrope between two worlds, and either one could destroy him. Yet, for the first time in his life, Eddie felt something he hadn't known before: purpose. He was no longer a petty thief or a fugitive. He was part of something larger, a secret war fought with lies instead of bullets. And though he'd never admit it aloud, he felt proud. He once told his handler, half-jokingly, "I used to blow up safes for money. Now I blow up the Germans' plans for free." Reed smiled. "Just make sure you don't blow yourself up in the process." Despite his growing attachment to the British cause, Eddie's double life took a toll. He couldn't tell anyone who he really was, not the women he charmed, not the friends he made, not even his family. To them, he was just a drifter, unreliable, unpredictable. But late at night, when he sat alone smoking by the window of his safe house, he often thought about what would happen when the war ended. Would MI5 thank him? Would anyone believe the story of a thief who saved his country by lying to its enemies? He suspected not. And maybe, deep down, that was fine with him. Eddie Chapman didn't need applause. What he needed was the thrill, that delicate, dangerous feeling of being one step ahead of everyone else. Months passed. His deception grew deeper. Then, one morning, MI5 received word. The Germans wanted their star agent back. They were so impressed with Fritz's success that they planned to extract him, to bring him to France for new orders. It was an extremely risky request. If Eddie returned to the continent, he'd be surrounded by the very people he'd deceived. But Chapman, true to his nature, didn't hesitate. He simply said, "Tell them I'm ready." Before leaving, his MI5 handlers handed him a miniature cyanide pill, a last resort if things went wrong. Eddie pocketed it, grinned, and replied, "Don't worry, I'll be back. The Germans still owe me a drink." And incredibly, he was right. When he landed in occupied France, the Germans greeted him like a hero. They awarded him the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors. Imagine it, a British criminal secretly working for MI5 being decorated by the enemy. It was the ultimate irony, and perhaps the greatest con of the war. From that moment on, Eddie Chapman was no longer just a double agent. He was living proof that deception could win battles as effectively as bombs. His reports continued to mislead the Germans for months, saving British factories and countless lives. And yet, no one outside the intelligence world would ever know his name. To the world, he was still a ghost, a man who belonged nowhere, moving in shadows, always one step away from exposure. But to MI5 and to history, he had become something else entirely. A symbol of how unpredictable heroes can be, and how, sometimes, the line between criminal and patriot is thinner than we'd like to believe. He had done the impossible. A British criminal, trained by the Nazis, rewarded by them, all while secretly serving the very country they sought to destroy. The Germans toasted his name. MI5 quietly marked his success. And Chapman, somewhere between the two worlds, simply smiled, as if he knew the game wasn't over yet. Because deep down, Eddie Chapman understood something no one else did. Deception, if played right, could be more powerful than any weapon. And soon, he was about to prove it. Not with words, not with charm, but with an illusion so convincing that even the enemy's most brilliant minds would believe it had destroyed one of Britain's proudest achievements. The winter of 1943 brought with it a silence across Britain, a tense, waiting kind of quiet. The air raids had lessened, but no one trusted the peace. And deep inside a safe house north of London, a man was preparing to fool the enemy in a way no one had ever dared before. Eddie Chapman sat at a wooden table, cigarette in hand, surrounded by MI5 officers. The room smelled of damp paper and pipe smoke, the air thick with anticipation. In front of him lay blueprints of the de Havilland aircraft factory, home of the Mosquito bomber, a plane so fast, so nimble, that it had become one of Britain's proudest weapons. The Germans wanted that factory gone, and they believed they had sent their man, Agent Fritz, to destroy it. But Chapman, now MI5's most daring double agent, was about to turn that expectation into a masterpiece of illusion. The plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and its audacity. MI5 would fake the entire destruction of the factory. They would stage a bombing so convincing that even aerial reconnaissance photos would confirm it. Broken glass, scattered debris, smoke-stained walls, every detail had to look real. Engineers and photographers were brought in. Piles of scrap metal were arranged to resemble collapsed roofs. Blackened wood was burned in controlled fires to mimic explosion marks. And at the center of it all stood Eddie Chapman, the man who would sell this lie to the enemy. He rehearsed every word of his report, every tiny detail. How he'd sneaked past guards, how the charges were planted, how the night sky lit up when the building blew. He even added flaws, small, believable inconsistencies that made his story sound human. When the message finally went out, encrypted and transmitted to France, MI5 waited. Hours later, the response came through. The Germans had bought it, completely. They congratulated him on his brilliant success, promised a reward, and sent their warmest regards from Berlin. Chapman smiled, exhaling a long stream of smoke. "Looks like the performance worked," he said quietly. But it wasn't just a performance, it was art. A deception so perfect that it fooled generals, analysts, and even Hitler's intelligence officers. And for that, the Germans awarded Eddie Chapman something no other British citizen would ever receive: the Iron Cross, a medal of valor handed out by the very regime he was secretly destroying. When the medal arrived, MI5 officers couldn't help but laugh in disbelief. One of them remarked, Only Eddie could pull this off, being honored by the enemy for saving his own country. Chapman wore the medal once, briefly, looking at it under the dim light of a safehouse lamp. Then he placed it back into its box. "Strange thing, isn't it?" he said. "A thief gets a medal for lying. And maybe that's what the world needs right now. A few good lies." He wasn't wrong, because that single act, that fabricated explosion, gave MI5 the credibility it needed to keep feeding false information to the Germans for years. It made Chapman one of the most trusted agents in the Nazi network, opening doors for countless other counterintelligence operations. But even amid the triumph, there were moments of stillness, of reflection. Late one night, after sending another coded message, Chapman found himself staring out the window, watching snowfall over London. He thought about what he'd become. Not a soldier, not a spy in the noble sense, but something in between. A man who fought with words and deceit instead of bullets. And though he'd saved lives, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing something of his own with each lie he told. For the first time, perhaps, Eddie Chapman felt the weight of his double life. The thrill that had once driven him now felt heavier, lonelier. Because behind every clever move, behind every success, there was a silence that followed. The silence of a man who could never tell anyone the truth. After the success of the de Havilland deception, Chapman continued to serve as Britain's invisible weapon. The Germans trusted him implicitly. They asked for reports, photos, and even requested his opinions on future missions. He gave them all, every detail carefully crafted by MI5. But back in Britain, the man who could outsmart empires sat alone in safe houses, drifting between missions, his life a blur of false names and borrowed rooms. And amid the secrecy, there were people, faces he couldn't forget. A woman in France who had once waited for him. Another in London who still believed he was someone else entirely. In the shadows of his success, a different kind of battle began. One between his heart and his duty. Between the man he used to be and the man he had to pretend to be now. Eddie Chapman had mastered the art of deception. But as the war dragged on, he was about to learn that the hardest lies aren't told to enemies. They're told to the people we care about. The greatest deception of the war had been a triumph of ingenuity and nerve. But now, the same man who fooled the Nazis would face something far more difficult to navigate. The truth of his own heart. He could outwit an army, manipulate generals, even charm his way past death itself. But when it came to love, to loyalty, Eddie Chapman would discover there are no codes, no disguises, and no safe houses to hide in. Only choices. And every choice would come with a cost. For every spy who ever walked the thin line between truth and lies, there comes a moment when the danger isn't in the mission, but in the heart. For Eddie Chapman, that moment came quietly, not on a battlefield, not under interrogation lights, but in the soft, ordinary moments of human connection. Amid coded messages and midnight rendezvous, there were women who saw something in him that even he could barely see himself, a man still capable of love. Her name was Betty Farmer, a Frenchwoman he met during his time under German supervision. She wasn't part of the war, not officially, just a kind soul who offered warmth in a world gone cold. With Betty, Eddie didn't have to be a spy or a criminal. He could laugh, tell stories, even dream. For a time, she made him forget who he was supposed to be. But every moment of peace carried a quiet ache, because Chapman knew it couldn't last. He lived in shadows, under false names, bound to secrets that could destroy not only himself, but anyone close to him. When he left France to return to England, he promised Betty he'd come back. And for a man whose entire life had been built on deception, that was perhaps the only truthful promise he ever made. Back in London, the war raged on, and with it came another kind of affection, softer, safer, but no less real. He met Frederica, a British woman who knew nothing of his past. To her, Eddie was charming, mysterious, a man who had business with the government, vague enough to be exciting, harmless enough to be believed. She loved him for who she thought he was, And maybe, in his own way, he loved her for believing it. But love built on secrecy is like a house built on sand. The more he cared, the heavier the lies became. Every mission, every coded transmission, every sudden disappearance, Frederica thought it was work. Eddie knew it was survival. He often sat awake beside her at night, watching her sleep, wondering what would happen if she ever knew the truth. Would she still see him as the man she loved, or as the stranger the world saw, a liar, a thief, a spy? The strange thing about Eddie Chapman is that for all his deceit, he never faked emotion. When he cared, he truly cared. When he lied, it was never out of cruelty, only necessity. And in those rare, quiet moments, away from the noise of war, he began to feel the toll of his own double life. He once told his MI5 handler, half-jokingly, "You can train a man to keep secrets, but not to stop feeling." Perhaps that was the truest thing he ever said. War has a way of stripping people down to what they really are. For some, it reveals courage. For others, fear. For Eddie Chapman, it revealed a contradiction. A man capable of risking everything for a cause, yet unable to hold on to the simplest thing, honesty and love. He tried, in small ways, to protect those he cared about. He wrote letters he never sent. He carried photographs in his pocket, folded and worn from too much handling. And when MI5 warned him that his attachments could jeopardize operations, he smiled sadly and said, "They already have. I just can't help it." By late 1944, the war was turning. Germany was losing ground, and Chapman's missions grew less frequent, though no less dangerous. The thrill that once defined his life began to fade. In its place was exhaustion, and something even deeper, loneliness. He'd spent years pretending to be someone else, and now he wasn't sure who Eddie Chapman really was anymore. The thief, the patriot, the deceiver, or just a man trying, against all odds, to feel human again. There's an old saying that love and loyalty rarely share the same bed. For Chapman, they never did. He was loyal to his country, but love belonged to the spaces in between. The fleeting moments, the stolen hours, the quiet promises that couldn't survive daylight. When he thought of Betty, he felt guilt. When he thought of Frederica, he felt sorrow. And when he thought of himself, he felt nothing. Because deep down, he knew that spies don't get happy endings. Eddie Chapman didn't die in the field or vanish behind enemy lines, but something inside him did fade. Quietly, invisibly, somewhere between love and duty. He would always be remembered as the man who fooled the Nazis, but rarely as the man who longed for something real, something no disguise or codename could ever give him. Love made him human. Loyalty kept him alive. The two could never coexist, not in the life he'd chosen. And in the end, that was the cruelest truth of all. The war was nearing its end, and the world that had once needed men like Eddie Chapman was beginning to disappear. The secrets, the missions, the disguises, all of it was coming to an inevitable close. And as the guns fell silent across Europe, Chapman found himself standing in a strange kind of peace. A peace that asked the one question no spy ever wants to face. When the game is over, who are you, really? By the spring of 1945, the sound of war was fading. The skies over Europe, once streaked with fire and smoke, grew quiet again. For the first time in years, people could look up without fear. And somewhere among them, Eddie Chapman, the man known to both sides as Agent Zigzag, was facing a silence he didn't quite know how to live with. For years, danger had been his rhythm, the heartbeat that kept him alive. Each mission, each coded message, each lie told with perfect conviction gave his life a strange electric purpose. But now the war was ending, and the question that haunted every spy hung over him too. When the world no longer needs your lies, what do you do with the truth? MI5 quietly informed him that his services were no longer required. No medals, no public praise, no grand farewell. Just a handshake, a few unmarked bills, and a polite "thank you for your service." They couldn't even tell the press what he'd done. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Chapman accepted it with a nod. He'd always known this was how it would end. Spies don't get parades. They disappear, swallowed by the very shadows that once kept them alive. He walked out of MI5's office that day and into a world that had already moved on. The pubs were open again, the music was louder, the people lighter. And in that normality, Eddie Chapman, the thief, the hero, the liar, suddenly felt like a ghost. He tried, for a while, to live like an ordinary man. He went to dinners, made small talk, even considered settling down. But ordinary life bored him in a way danger never did. He would sit in quiet bars, swirling his drink, listening to people boast about their wartime adventures, and smile to himself, knowing that his were the kind no one would ever believe. Sometimes he'd open the old box where he kept his medals and papers, the Iron Cross from the Germans, a few cryptic notes from MI5, and photographs of faces long gone. He never showed them to anyone. They weren't trophies, they were reminders. Reminders of how far deceit can take a man and how lonely it can leave him. Despite the secrecy, stories about him began to leak. A newspaper here, a whispered name there. People spoke of a British double agent who had tricked the Nazis into believing a factory had been destroyed. But Chapman didn't chase the fame. When asked once if he'd ever tell his full story, he laughed and said, "It wouldn't matter. Half the world would call me a liar, and the other half already knows I am one." As the years passed, the sharp edges of wartime blurred into memory. Britain rebuilt itself, and Eddie faded quietly into civilian life, though civilian never quite fit him. He dabbled in small ventures, traveled occasionally, lived comfortably but never lavishly. He still had his charm, that easy smile that could win over anyone in a room. Yet, there were nights when the past returned. The flash of a coded radio, the echo of boots on cobblestones, the soft voice of a woman long lost to war. They came to him not as memories, but as ghosts, reminders that the game he played had never really ended. Because deep down, Chapman understood something few others did. Once you've lived a life built on secrets, you never truly come back from it. One autumn afternoon, he met an old intelligence officer from MI5 in a small London cafe. They talked like two men who had seen too much. At one point, the officer asked, "If you had the chance to do it all again, would you?" Chapman stirred his tea, thought for a moment, then said quietly, "Probably, but I'd lie better next time." The officer laughed, but Chapman didn't. Behind the grin was something sad, almost tender, the look of a man who'd played the game too long and finally learned the cost of winning. By the time the 1950s arrived, Chapman's story was more rumor than history. The files about his missions were locked away, sealed under classified stamps, and Eddie lived in the small spaces between anonymity and myth. He never wrote a memoir. He never demanded recognition. He just kept moving, like he always had, slipping between identities, between versions of himself. And yet, for all the shadows and deception, Eddie Chapman never stopped being Eddie Chapman. Flawed, reckless, magnetic. The man who made both sides believe what he wanted them to. In the quiet years that followed, he found a kind of peace. Not the peace of innocence, but of acceptance. He'd done terrible things, and great things. He'd lied to survive, but he'd also saved lives through those lies. History, he realized, doesn't always separate heroes from criminals. Sometimes it makes them the same person. The war had ended, but Eddie Chapman's legend was just beginning to take shape. Whispered in pubs, studied in secret archives, and later immortalized in books and films. He'd spent a lifetime zigzagging between truth and lies, and when it was all over, history couldn't quite decide where to place him, as a rogue, a patriot, or perhaps both. But one thing was certain, In the grand, chaotic theater of World War II, no one ever played the game quite like Agent Zigzag. History rarely knows what to do with men like Eddie Chapman. Heroes are supposed to be noble. Villains are supposed to be cruel. But Chapman, Agent Zigzag, lived somewhere in between, blurring every line that history tries to draw. To the Germans, he was Agent Fritz, a daring saboteur, trusted enough to receive the Iron Cross. To the British, he was Agent Zigzag, a master of deception, who fed false intelligence straight into the heart of the Nazi war machine. And to himself? He was just Eddie, a thief who stumbled into history and somehow changed it. After the war, his story sat locked away in dusty MI5 files for decades. The world moved on without knowing the man who had risked everything behind enemy lines. Not for glory, but for the thrill, for the game, and, in his own strange way, for his country. When the files were finally declassified, the world discovered a spy unlike any other. Not a trained intelligence officer, not a polished patriot, but a man with the instincts of a criminal and the courage of a hero. Eddie Chapman had tricked the Nazis, outsmarted the best minds of German intelligence, and somehow, through charm, nerve, and sheer audacity, survived to tell the tale. Writers, historians, and filmmakers would later debate who he really was. Was he a con man who happened to serve Britain's interests? Or a patriot disguised as a criminal? The truth, like most of Chapman's life, was somewhere in the middle. He wasn't perfect, not even close. He stole, he lied, he broke hearts. But he also saved lives, derailed enemy operations, and gave the British intelligence community one of its greatest victories. Maybe that's why his codename fits so perfectly. Zigzag, never straight, never predictable, always moving between two worlds. Those who met him later in life described a man both charming and restless. He could talk about the war with a glint in his eye, but there was always a distance in his voice, as if part of him was still back there, in the smoke and shadows of occupied Europe. He once said to a journalist, half serious, half amused, "I wasn't loyal to either side. I was loyal to the adventure." And maybe that was his truest confession. Because Eddie Chapman didn't just play the game, he was the game. A man who used deceit to serve the truth, and found meaning not in being good or bad, but in being alive when he shouldn't have been. Today, his story lives on in documentaries, novels, and the fading pages of wartime history. But beyond all that, Eddie Chapman remains a reminder that even in an age defined by loyalty and betrayal, there were those who didn't fit either label. They were the ones who lived in the gray, and from that gray, they helped shape the world. In the grand, chaotic theater of World War II, no one danced through danger quite like Agent Zigzag. The thief who became a spy, the liar who told the truth, and the man who proved that sometimes the most unlikely people leave the deepest mark on history. If stories like this make you see history in a new light, not just dates and battles, but lives full of choices and contradictions, then you're in the right place. Hit subscribe, leave a comment about what surprised you most in Eddie Chapman's story, and share this video with someone who loves hidden stories from history. Because the past is never really gone. It's just waiting for us to listen.